On July 14, 1944, near St. Louis, France, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley stood with his arms folded, observing a Sherman tank retreating from a hedgerow that had halted American progress for 6 weeks. Beside him were several officers, including Major General Leonard Giro, the commander of 5th Corps, and ordnance experts who had been brought in to witness what could be either a significant breakthrough or yet another failed attempt. The contraption attached to the tank consisted of 4 steel prongs protruding from its front end, resembling tusks, a device that Bradley initially disregarded when it was first reported to him due to its simplicity. However, with the American breakout from Normandy hanging in the balance and desperate circumstances demanding innovative solutions, Bradley decided to give it a chance. The tank's engine revved up as the driver shifted into gear and advanced towards the dense vegetation at 10 miles per hour, then 15. As the steel prongs made contact with the hedgerow, a tearing sound echoed through the air, a noise that would soon become commonplace for American tankers throughout France in the weeks to come. Soil and roots erupted upward in a shower of dirt as the tank continued its advance. The vehicle did not climb or tilt. Instead, it drove straight through, cutting into the base of the hedgerow like giant knives slicing through thick fabric. In less than 5 seconds, the Sherman emerged on the other side, trailing broken branches and torn foliage but otherwise unscathed. Its belly armor remained protected from enemy fire. Bradley's staff officers erupted in cheers, while ordnance specialists scrambled to examine both the tank and the breach it had created, measuring the gap and checking for any damage. For a moment, the general remained silent as he weighed the implications. If this device proved reliable and could be mass-produced, if it could be installed on enough tanks before the upcoming offensive, then perhaps Operation Cobra might succeed, breaking the deadlock. He then addressed Lieutenant Colonel John Madaris, his chief ordnance officer, with words that would alter the course of the war. "I want these devices manufactured and fitted to as many tanks as possible. Every Sherman, every Stuart, every tank destroyer we can modify. They must be ready by the time Operation Cobra begins. Continuous production day and night. Mobilize every ordnance unit, maintenance depot, welder at our disposal. This is a top priority." What Bradley had just witnessed was a solution to an issue that could have turned the largest amphibious invasion in history into a prolonged deadlock. For 6 weeks, German forces in Normandy had thwarted the mightiest army ever assembled. The hedgerows, centuries-old boundaries between Norman fields, were more formidable than German concrete fortifications and deadlier than minefields or the Atlantic Wall. Yet the man who found this ingenious solution was not a seasoned general with decades of experience, nor an MIT-trained engineer. Instead, it was a 29-year-old sergeant from New Jersey who had crafted a device using scrap metal from German beach obstacles along with common sense and a welding torch. This is the tale of how Curtis Culin's straightforward welding technique broke the Normandy deadlock in just 1 week, opening the path to Germany. Meanwhile, 300 miles away at Southwick House near Portsmouth, Supreme Commander Dwight David Eisenhower was pacing back and forth in his headquarters, scrutinizing maps that revealed an increasingly dire situation. It was mid-June 1944. The D-Day landings, carried out just a few days prior, exceeded even the most optimistic expectations. Although American troops suffered devastating losses on Omaha Beach and nearly faced defeat, by the end of June 6, over 150,000 Allied soldiers, Americans, British, and Canadians, had secured beachheads spanning 50 miles of France's coastline. Within a week, more than 300,000 troops had landed, establishing a continuous front from the Cotentin Peninsula to Caen. The largest amphibious assault in history breached Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Fortress Europe, which Nazi propaganda claimed was impenetrable, had been pierced. However, the situation on the ground painted a more ominous picture. While the landings were successful and the beaches secure, supplies flowed through two artificial harbors and directly onto the shorelines. The rapid inland advance that Allied strategists envisioned had stalled almost immediately. By mid-June, 2 weeks after D-Day, the Allies controlled a beachhead just 20 miles deep and 50 miles wide. Over 1 million troops were now on French soil, but were confined to a narrow coastal area, suffering heavy casualties daily, and facing the grim possibility that the invasion could degenerate into static trench warfare reminiscent of World War I. The grand strategy, meticulously planned over 2 years, aimed for a swift breakout from the beachhead. British and Canadian forces were supposed to capture Caen, a vital road and rail junction on D-Day, then push southward into open tank country. American troops would cross the Cotentin Peninsula, seize the port of Cherbourg within 9 days, and move south towards Brittany. Within 2 weeks, Allied forces were expected to penetrate 15 miles inland along a continuous front. The plan called for rapid exploitation, mobile warfare, armored thrusts deep into German rear areas. Instead, the Allies found themselves entangled in grueling close-quarters combat, advancing by mere yards at a time, and suffering severe casualties for small territorial gains. The culprit was the Bocage terrain of Normandy, with its dense hedgerows that impeded movement and made every inch of ground fiercely contested. On June 7, 1944, just 1 day after the successful landings on Omaha Beach, soldiers from the 1st Infantry Division began pushing inland from the coast. They were drained from the beach invasion, which had resulted in nearly 2,000 casualties during the landing. Yet they remained alive and had breached the Atlantic Wall. They anticipated encountering retreating German forces or hastily erected defenses within the villages and towns inland. Instead, they discovered a terrain that seemed crafted by nature to benefit defenders and hinder attackers, a lush labyrinth that would prove more perilous than the fortifications they had just overcome. Private James Henderson of the 26th Infantry Regiment documented his thoughts on this first day in his diary, a passage later unearthed decades later at the National Archives. "We believed we had conquered our greatest obstacle after the beach landing," he wrote. "Having triumphed over the Atlantic Wall and survived Hitler's worst, we thought all was well until we encountered these hedgerows, these cursed Norman hedges. God help us! God help us all." These hedgerows were unlike anything American soldiers had ever seen before. They weren't decorative shrub borders familiar to suburban yards back home, nor simple agricultural fencing that could be easily dismantled or navigated around. Instead, they were centuries-old fortifications built by Norman farmers since the Middle Ages. The process began 1,000 years ago when farmers cleared their fields of stones and rocks, stacking them along property boundaries as markers for ownership and livestock barriers. Over generations, more materials were added: stones, earth, and vegetation that grew on top, gradually transforming these walls into earthen banks ranging from 3 to 12 feet in height and 1 to 10 feet thick at the base. The soil packed tightly over centuries of compression, fortified by plant roots, formed a structure as hard as concrete. Trees like oaks and hawthorns, along with brambles, wild roses, and thorns, intertwined into barriers rising up to 15 feet above the ground. The deep-rooted systems embedded within these banks made them virtually impenetrable without heavy machinery or significant explosive charges, capable of revealing American positions to German forces miles away. The fields enclosed by these hedgerows varied in size, but typically measured between 200 and 400 yards across, creating an irregular patchwork that added further complexity to the battlefield. The layout of the fields varied greatly. Some were nearly square, others elongated and narrow, while a few took on triangular shapes. This chaotic arrangement was centuries in the making, shaped by inheritance laws, land divisions, and farming customs over a millennium. Aerial imagery captured by reconnaissance planes just weeks before D-Day exposed the scale of this issue, though military strategists initially overlooked its tactical importance. One image from the American sector, covering an area of 8 square miles around St. Louis, revealed nearly 4,000 individual fields enclosed by hedges. Each field presented a formidable obstacle, with hedgerows acting as natural barriers and defensive fortifications. The entire American front, extending from the coastline to the base of the Cotentin Peninsula and southward towards St. Louis, was crisscrossed with these thousands of hedgerow walls. For German troops, every hedgerow offered an advantageous defensive position, surpassing anything designed by military engineers. By digging firing positions into the earth banks, machine gun teams could create small apertures for their weapon barrels, offering clear lines of sight over the open fields while remaining concealed from enemy view. These positions were nearly invisible beyond a few yards and provided excellent protection against artillery fire due to the shielding effect of the soil and embankments. The dense vegetation atop the hedgerows further concealed them from aerial surveillance. From above, reconnaissance aircraft observed only an uninterrupted green canopy. However, on the ground, soldiers found shelter from shrapnel and small arms fire within these earth walls. A German soldier positioned behind a hedgerow was more secure than one stationed in a concrete pillbox, because the former could remain undetected until firing commenced, whereas the latter would be easily spotted and targeted. The tactical benefits for defenders were immense. An 8 to 9-man squad equipped with a machine gun and rifles, strategically placed along a hedgerow, could control an entire field and resist attacks from an American company of 200 soldiers for extended periods. The Germans did not need continuous defensive lines or man every single hedgerow to effectively repel the advancing Allied forces. They deployed small units strategically across the terrain, establishing overlapping defensive positions that supported one another. As U.S. forces advanced across open fields, they encountered fire from multiple hedgerows, not just those directly ahead but also from flanking positions, which created a crossfire turning each field into a deadly area. The attackers faced significant tactical challenges that were nearly insurmountable with the resources and doctrine at their disposal. Infantrymen crossing these exposed areas had no cover. There were no trees, rocks, or depressions in the Normandy fields, only open grass or crops, all under constant German fire from concealed positions. The Germans had pre-registered their weapons on likely points of American advance, calculating ranges and angles to deliver precise fire the moment U.S. troops emerged from one hedgerow into another. Advancing toward the next hedgerow was a perilous journey through predetermined killing zones where gunners did not need to aim, as they fired at fixed targets with deadly accuracy. Sunken lanes connecting the fields were also lethal due to their confined nature and historical use for transportation. These narrow paths, sometimes only wide enough for a single vehicle, served as natural bottlenecks for advancing U.S. troops, making them ideal ambush spots for German defenders who would obstruct the lanes with fallen trees or debris, and then position machine guns to cover these obstacles from hidden positions. American soldiers trying to clear these lanes were funneled into narrow passages where a single machine gun could halt an entire platoon's advance. Meanwhile, American tanks, the reliable Sherman medium tanks designed for mobile warfare, were rendered ineffective by the terrain. Despite being well-armed and capable of outproducing German factories with over 1,000 Shermans manufactured monthly, these vehicles struggled to operate effectively in the Bocage landscape. Despite all the benefits they offered, Sherman tanks were rendered ineffective due to the challenges posed by the Bocage terrain. The earth banks were too thick robustly fortified with extensive root systems that made them nearly impenetrable. Although a Sherman's 75 gun could blast an opening through the vegetation atop these embankments, it was insufficient for the tank to maneuver through. The ground underneath remained unscathed. Frustration mounting among the tank commanders, some resorted to brute force tactics in an attempt to breach these obstacles. They would back up and build momentum before charging directly at a hedgerow, hoping that their vehicle's weight and power would either crush it or enable them to climb over it. However, this strategy was perilous. When a Sherman tank attempted to scale a hedgerow, its front end would rise as it ascended the earthen barrier. This caused the tank to tilt backward at an angle of about 30 to 40 degrees, exposing the vulnerable underside. The belly of the vehicle, where only 1 inch of armor provided protection against mine fragments, but offered little defense against anti-tank weaponry. A German infantryman armed with a Panzerfaust, an easily portable shoulder-fired rocket launcher, could wait in the next field and target the exposed underbelly. Upon hearing the approaching tank, he would spot the front rising above the vegetation and then fire when the belly armor was visible. Typically, 1 shot from the Panzerfaust was enough to destroy a Sherman, as its 6-inch penetration capability rendered the inch-thick steel armor virtually useless. Lieutenant Colonel Wesley Yale, who commanded a battalion of Shermans in the 2nd Armored Division, lost 4 tanks and their crews within a single morning while attempting to breach hedgerows near Aisne-sur-Mer. 4 vehicles were destroyed, 16 men killed or wounded, yet not a single successful break was achieved. His report filed on June 15 encapsulated the fury and despair shared by every American armored commander operating in Normandy at that time. Our tanks fall prey to an unseen foe who sets up in strategic positions, beyond fields or behind hedges, and waits patiently for our approach. With keen ears attuned to the rumble of our engines, they detect when we are ascending the obstacles and strike once our underbellies are revealed at the crest. Consequently, our crews suffer heavy losses without ever facing their adversaries directly. What ought to be a formidable asset has turned into a perilous liability in this treacherous terrain. American units attempted various strategies based on their training and doctrine. Combat engineers equipped with expertise in explosives were dispatched to breach the hedgerows. Properly deployed charges of TNT or Composition C could indeed create passable gaps, but significant issues arose. First, the procedure was laborious. It involved moving forward under enemy fire, setting up the explosives, connecting detonators, retreating to a safe location, and initiating the blast. Under optimal conditions, this sequence took between 10 and 15 minutes, but could extend much longer in combat situations. Secondly, the explosions served as loud signals of our impending movements, alerting every German within earshot, potentially covering several miles, in the otherwise tranquil Norman landscape. Enemy forces promptly trained their guns on these newly created openings before the smoke even dissipated. Lastly, tanks and infantry advancing through such breaches found themselves confined to narrow paths that were pre-designated kill zones for German gunners, who simply aimed at these gaps without searching further. Specialized armored vehicles like bulldozer tanks did not offer substantial improvement in this context. These were standard Sherman tanks equipped with heavy steel bulldozer blades attached to the front, initially designed to clear beach obstacles during amphibious operations. Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Chinese letter 75, Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. 14. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. 11. Chinese letter. Chinese letter, Chinese letter, 7. Chinese letter, Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. Chinese letter, DDOI, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. 10,000 Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. 1,000 Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 2,000 Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, DDOI Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 29 Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Fresh arrivals in Normandy found themselves thrust into battle with little to no training, joining seasoned units to compensate for losses sustained by fallen comrades and those wounded on the battlefield. Initially buoyed by the triumph of D-Day, morale was now plummeting rapidly. Soldiers who had endured the perilous beach landings began to crack under the relentless and brutal nature of combat in the Hedgerows. General Omar Nelson Bradley, commanding the 1st United States Army, grappled with a crisis that endangered not only his reputation, but also the overarching strategic goals for Europe's liberation. His troops were weary, disheartened, and suffering heavy losses among their infantry ranks, which could not be sustained indefinitely. To the east, British and Canadian forces engaged in fighting around Caen made scant headway against formidable German armor. Field Marshal Montgomery's plan to capture Caen on D-Day had failed utterly. The city would not fall until mid-July, a month later than anticipated. The grand strategy that had shaped 2 years of planning, a vision of swift breakthroughs and mobile warfare across France, was crumbling into static trench warfare reminiscent of World War I. Bradley's chief of staff, Major General Walter Bedell Smith, who also served as Eisenhower's chief of staff at Supreme Headquarters, articulated the dire situation in stark terms. In a memorandum to Eisenhower, he described how every small field had become a fortress and each hedgerow a stronghold for German forces. "We are reliving World War I," Smith wrote, "but with green, living trenches. Our mobility, armor, and firepower advantages are rendered ineffective by the terrain." The Germans were trading space for casualties and gaining an upper hand in this exchange. The German defense of Normandy was remarkably effective in its simplicity and efficiency. Instead of attempting to maintain a continuous front line, which would have required more troops than they possessed, German commanders deployed small infantry units throughout the Bocage region. Utilizing natural fortifications, these defenders created a layered defensive system that conventional tactics could scarcely breach. A typical German defensive position typically consisted of 2 or 3 machine gun teams, a mortar crew, and several riflemen, perhaps 20 to 30 soldiers in total. These units would occupy clusters of hedgerows, setting up interlocking fields of fire and mutually supportive positions. When American forces attacked, the Germans waited until the Americans were fully committed before unleashing devastating fire from their concealed positions. The German MG-42 machine gun, firing up to 1,200 rounds per minute, could decimate entire American platoons within seconds. The Americans would then seek cover and request artillery support while trying to pinpoint the enemy's positions. However, by the time the artillery shells started falling, the Germans had already relocated to alternative firing spots in neighboring hedgerows, leaving the Americans targeting empty locations as German fire shifted direction entirely. German tactics maximized every advantage offered by the terrain. Machine gunners would dig deep into the banks of the hedgerows, creating tunnels or small caves that provided overhead protection from artillery and complete concealment from ground-level observation. The firing ports were just large enough for the machine gun barrel, around 6 inches in diameter, and camouflaged with cut vegetation, making them nearly invisible beyond a few feet. The German soldiers could operate their weapons safely inside these concealed positions, protected except from direct hits by heavy artillery shells, while they targeted American troops on open fields without facing significant risk themselves. Snipers also utilized the elevated positions provided by trees growing atop the hedgerows to observe and target American officers and non-commissioned officers. The loss of small unit leaders was especially damaging to American forces. A rifle company that lost its experienced sergeants and lieutenants in the early days of combat would remain less effective even when receiving new leadership, because these replacements lacked familiarity with their men and the mutual trust needed for cohesion under fire. German snipers deliberately aimed at anyone who appeared to be issuing orders or carrying maps and radios. The Germans demonstrated exceptional care and discipline in camouflage. Each morning, they replaced wilted camouflage materials with fresh branches, covered vehicle tracks, and sometimes even attempted to make flattened grass stand upright again. They dug tunnels beneath hedgerows to create secure routes for moving between defensive positions without exposure to American fire. Some units constructed intricate trench systems connecting multiple hedgerows, forming underground networks that enabled entire squads to move from position to position undetected by aerial or ground observers. The psychological impact of such combat on American troops was severe and cumulative. Soldiers who had endured the horrors of Omaha Beach, facing German machine guns and artillery during the landing, thought they had experienced the worst combat imaginable. Yet the Bocage fighting proved even more terrifying because, unlike on the beach where enemy positions were visible here, the Germans were largely invisible until it was too late to react effectively. In the hedgerows, death lurked unseen from positions impossible to pinpoint until they unleashed their fire. Every field posed a deadly threat, and every advance across open terrain was a harrowing journey into fear, anticipating the moment when German machine guns would cut you down without warning. Captain Joseph Ewing, who served with the 175th Infantry Regiment of the 29th Division, depicted the approach to St. Lo in terms that vividly captured the suffocating nature of hedgerow warfare. He later wrote, "After the war, we pushed through a labyrinthine network of natural fortifications stretching for miles. Each hedgerow was a potential enemy position, and every field crossing could prove fatal. We could see no more than one field ahead. We had no way to locate German positions until they fired at us." The constant tension, the ever-present awareness that machine gun fire might erupt from unseen locations at any moment, drained morale faster than actual combat did. Veterans grew hollow-eyed and trembled, while new arrivals broke under the strain within days. In this dire situation, where the Normandy campaign teetered on the brink of failure and American casualties mounted by the thousands with no apparent solution, an ordinary soldier proposed an extraordinary idea. Curtis Grub Culin III was 29 years old in the summer of 1944. Serving as a sergeant with the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, under the command of the 102nd Cavalry Group, operating within 5th Corps. He held no special status within the vast hierarchy of the American Army. He lacked advanced degrees and had no engineering background. His life story was unremarkable, one that millions of soldiers could relate to across the armed forces. Culin hailed from Cranford, New Jersey, a small town roughly 15 miles west of New York City. His father was employed by a liquor distributor as a salesperson. Curtis attended public schools in his hometown and graduated from Cleveland High School in Cranford in 1935. Before the war began, he worked at Schenley Industries, which also hired his father as a sales promotion assistant. When war broke out, he joined the New Jersey National Guard and was called up with his unit. He received training to become both a tanker and a driver. He knew how to operate and maintain a Sherman tank and was well-versed in armored combat tactics. However, he did not possess any specialized technical knowledge that would indicate he could solve an issue that had stumped the top military minds in America. What Curtis Culin possessed was something unteachable in schools or through formal training. He had practical American ingenuity, a knack for problem-solving developed during the Great Depression when resources were scarce, and one learned to fix things independently. The ability to make do with whatever materials were at hand and devise solutions without waiting for others to intervene. This trait was uniquely American, valuing personal initiative and tangible results over formal qualifications and theoretical understanding. It echoed through generations of American inventors and innovators, from Benjamin Franklin's experiments with electricity to the Wright brothers crafting an airplane in a bicycle shop. In early July 1944, while on a temporary break from combat operations, soldiers from Culin's unit gathered informally to discuss the hedgerow problem. This was not an official meeting or strategy session. It was just troops coming together to vent and share ideas. Tank crews, infantrymen, and officers all participated in the conversation. They spoke about comrades who had been injured or killed and recounted incidents where tanks were destroyed while trying to clear hedgerows. The group threw out various solutions, many of which were unfeasible or unrealistic. During one part of the conversation, a Tennessee soldier proposed an idea that many in attendance perceived as either a joke or the ravings of someone suffering from combat fatigue. Max Hastings, a military historian whose 1984 book, Overlord, D-Day to Berlin recounts events during World War II, refers to this individual simply as a Tennessee hillbilly named Roberts without specifying his first name, rank, unit, or providing any corroborative documentation. Despite thorough investigations by other historians over the years, no primary evidence has been discovered to validate either the soldier's identity or his story. Hastings writes that the unnamed soldier suggested attaching saw teeth to the front of a tank to cut through hedges. This proposal was met with amusement or immediate dismissal from fellow soldiers who found it absurd. The notion seemed outlandish, akin to something from a cartoon. However, Curtis Culin, who was present at the time, did not laugh along with everyone else. He discerned an underlying mechanical principle in the crude suggestion. If tanks couldn't maneuver over hedgerows without revealing their vulnerable undersides and couldn't break through them using sheer force, perhaps they could cut through them instead. Culin envisioned a set of sturdy steel prongs or tusks extending from the front of the tank at a downward angle. As the tank approached a hedge, these prongs would dig into the ground and banks rather than riding up over the obstacle's surface. With full power applied to the engine, the prongs would cut through roots and earth while maintaining the tank's stability and preventing it from tilting upward dangerously. This method allowed the tank to pass through at ground level as debris was pushed aside. The idea was straightforward yet effective and within the technological capabilities of the time. However, fabricating such a device required robust materials capable of slicing through centuries-old compacted earth and dense root systems. They had to weigh enough to maintain their stability during combat, but not so much that they overloaded the tank's suspension or hindered its maneuverability. Additionally, they required high-quality steel that could withstand the immense stresses involved in penetrating hedgerows. The question was where such materials could be obtained in Normandy by July 1944. The answer lay right on the beaches where Allied forces had landed 6 weeks earlier. Prior to D-Day, German engineers had installed thousands of obstacles along the Normandy coastline to impede the progress of landing craft. Among these were devices known as Czech hedgehogs, due to their resemblance to anti-tank barriers developed by the Czech army before World War II. Each hedgehog consisted of 3 steel I-beams, industrial-grade structural steel about 6 feet long, welded together at angles, forming a 6-pointed barrier designed to puncture landing craft hulls or serve as anchor points for mines. In practice, most of these obstacles had been bypassed or destroyed during the invasion. Thousands of Czech hedgehogs now littered the beaches where they failed to halt the Allied advance. Some were pushed aside by landing forces, others were detonated by combat engineers, and some were simply ignored. The steel beams remained largely intact and in excellent condition, being collected at salvage yards behind the beaches for shipment back to England. This was precisely what Culin required: high-quality structural steel, already cut into convenient lengths, available in virtually unlimited quantities. All he needed was permission to experiment with them and access to welding equipment. He found it surprisingly easy to get approval from his superiors, as officers at all levels of the American Army were eager for any solution to address the hedgerow problem. When Culin approached his company commander with rough sketches and an explanation of his idea, including where he planned to source materials, the captain gave immediate approval. Within 48 hours, Culin had secured access to a Sherman tank for experiments, welding equipment from the unit maintenance section, and authorization to form a work party to retrieve steel beams from a salvage yard near Omaha Beach. The prototype was completed in just 3 days early in July 1944. With 4 sections of steel beam, each about 5 feet long and weighing around 100 pounds, Culin's team began constructing their invention at the salvage yard. Using cutting torches, they beveled the forward ends of the beams to create angled cutting edges that would better penetrate earth and roots compared to blunt ends. A horizontal crossbar was welded onto the front hull of the tank to secure the 4 prongs in place, ensuring an even distribution across its width. Next, they attached this assembly, including both the crossbar and the prongs, firmly to the lower part of the Sherman's frontal armor plate, with the prongs angled slightly downwards and extending forward from the vehicle. Despite its simplicity, the setup was effective. The result featured 4 sturdy steel protrusions jutting out from the tank's front hull at an approximate 10-degree angle below horizontal, ready to penetrate a head row if necessary. This addition increased the Sherman's weight by around 400 pounds, which, although noticeable, did not significantly impact its performance. However, with the prongs extending about 4 feet beyond the normal profile of the tank, drivers needed extra caution during tight maneuvers. Nevertheless, should the contraption prove successful, these minor inconveniences would be deemed worthwhile. The initial test took place on July 11, 1944, in a field near Asina Summer, several miles inland from Omaha Beach. A small crowd of approximately 20 soldiers, primarily tank crew members and officers from Culin's unit, gathered to witness the event. Most of them anticipated another failed attempt since numerous previous solutions had proven ineffective against Hedgerows. Welding steel prongs onto a tank seemed improbable compared to other methods like explosives or bulldozers that had already been tried without success. Yet, they were willing to observe out of curiosity and possibly to report back on yet another idea failing. The chosen test site was an ordinary head row representative of the typical bocage encountered in Normandy. It measured roughly 4 feet tall at ground level with a dense vegetation layer extending 15 feet high, featuring mature oak trees around 5 inches thick. This setup accurately reflected what American tankers faced daily. If Culin's apparatus could breach this standard obstacle, it would likely handle most of the head rows in the region. The Sherman retreated to gain momentum before approaching the test site. The driver, a nervous corporal from Pennsylvania whose name remains unknown in historical records, was aware that if the device failed, and the tank became stuck on the head row like so many others had, he and his crew could suffer fatal consequences due to the bocage's nature. However, he placed his faith in Sergeant Curtis, who had meticulously outlined the theory and appeared convinced it would succeed. The driver switched gears, advanced the throttle, and steered directly toward the head row, starting at 5 miles per hour, accelerating to 8, then 10. When the tank made contact with the head row, its prongs led the way. A loud tearing sound echoed as steel sliced through earth and roots. The prongs sank deep into the ground. For an instant, it seemed the vehicle might stall due to resistance from the obstacle. However, the engine roared louder and the driver pressed full throttle. The tank's treads gripped the terrain firmly, propelling it forward. Soil and debris were hurled up over the tank's hull by the force of impact. Branches cracked and broke apart. Tree trunks splintered into pieces. Vegetation fell onto the turret and rear deck. In less than 5 seconds after crashing through, the Sherman emerged on the other side of the head row, trailing broken branches and torn roots yet otherwise unscathed. The tank did not scale the barrier. Instead, it cut through at ground level precisely as Culin had foreseen. Witnessing soldiers erupted in cheers and shouts. Some were moved to tears, but these were tears of relief and optimism, not sorrow. For 6 weeks, They had witnessed friends succumb to futile efforts to overcome these barriers. For 6 weeks, they felt powerless in the face of terrain that appeared insurmountable. Suddenly and unexpectedly, a rudimentary apparatus crafted from discarded metal materials resolved their predicament. The tank crews encircled Culin, grasping his hand firmly, slapping him on the back with enthusiasm, and expressing gratitude that made the humble sergeant feel uncomfortable. Officers who had observed the initial demonstration were already contemplating the broader implications. If this device functioned once, it could likely be replicated multiple times. If one tank could be adapted, all tanks might undergo similar modifications. Should the device prove as straightforward and expedient to manufacture as it seemed, then perhaps the entire American armored force could be outfitted before the scheduled offensive operation commenced. However, a single successful test was insufficient to alter the trajectory of a military campaign entirely. The invention required rigorous testing under diverse conditions to establish its reliability. Over the following 2 days, additional trials were carried out with varying hedgerows, angles of approach, and speeds. Each trial yielded positive results. The device demonstrated consistent and safe performance. Tank operators swiftly mastered the optimal techniques, driving at 10 to 12 miles per hour directly toward the hedgerow without angling it. Delivering full throttle upon impact ensured that the prongs would dig into the ground as intended, allowing the tank to pass through unimpeded and avoid exposing its underbelly. The average breaching time was 5 to 8 seconds from point of contact until emergence on the opposite side. News of Cullin's innovations rapidly spread throughout the 2nd Armored Division and beyond. Major General Edward Brooks, commanding the division, requested a formal demonstration just 3 days after the first successful test had been reported to him. Brooks was a skilled and proactive leader who had a deep understanding of armor tactics and knew how to identify a tactical advantage when he saw one. He quickly grasped the importance of Cullin's invention and recognized the need to showcase it to the person whose endorsement would ensure its mass production and widespread adoption. On July 13, General Brooks dispatched a message to 1st Army Headquarters requesting that Lieutenant General Omar Bradley visit the 2nd Armored Division for a demonstration of an innovative hedgerow breaching device. Initially skeptical due to his heavy workload and previous failures with similar solutions, Bradley ultimately agreed to pay a visit on July 14, 1944. On this crucial day, Bradley arrived at the designated site accompanied by Major General Leonard Giro from 5th Corps along with several ordnance experts. 2 tanks had been prepared for the demonstration, an M5 Aeon Stuart light tank and a Sherman medium tank, both outfitted with Cullin's device. The chosen hedgerow represented typical Bocage terrain, 5-foot earth banks topped with dense foliage and mature trees that had hindered American advances for weeks. From safe vantage points, Bradley and his officers watched intently as the demonstration began. First, the light tank moved back to build up momentum before charging straight into the hedgerow. The impact was immediate, generating a powerful sound of tearing earth and breaking roots, along with a spray of dirt that shot upward. Within 5 seconds, the tank had cleared the obstacle. Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Within just 2 minutes, the solution had been demonstrated twice, proving its simplicity, reliability, and feasibility with readily available materials. He then turned to his ordnance chief and gave the orders that would alter everything. The subsequent discussion, lasting less than 10 minutes, initiated an unprecedented manufacturing effort in terms of both speed and scale. General Bradley insisted on having these devices installed on as many tanks as possible before Operation Cobra commenced. Scheduled to start in 11 days, on July 25th, this left only 11 days for the production and distribution of hundreds of units across Normandy's scattered military units. It necessitated around-the-clock manufacturing, mobilizing every ordnance unit, maintenance depot, and welder within the American sector. The device had been invented less than a week prior, requiring an improvised mass production system to meet the tight deadline. Lieutenant Colonel John Medeiros, a 1930 West Point graduate and seasoned logistics expert with extensive military experience, was entrusted with overseeing this manufacturing program. He recognized immediately that this was not just another production task. It was an emergency initiative crucial for determining the outcome of the Normandy campaign. Within hours of receiving his directive on July 14th, Medeiros issued orders to initiate the swiftest military production process seen during World War II. Every ordnance company, maintenance battalion, and repair depot in the American sector received instructions to begin immediate fabrication of hedgerow cutting devices. Detailed specifications were conveyed via telephone and radio communication. Each device required 4 5-foot-long steel prongs, fashioned from German beech obstacle metal, with beveled cutting edges at their forward ends. A crossbar secured these prongs in place, and the entire assembly was welded to the lower front hull of a tank. The design was straightforward enough for any skilled welder to construct, but intricate enough to demand meticulous work to ensure durability under combat conditions. There was an ample supply of raw materials available. Salvage yards situated behind the beaches were filled with thousands of tons of steel, scavenged from dismantled German fortifications. Trucks started transporting these steel beams to ordnance units spread throughout Normandy. The beams arrived in bundles, still encrusted with rust and barnacles from their time submerged underwater. Some exhibited damage caused by explosives or artillery fire. Ordnance personnel sorted through the beams, picking out those that were straight and undamaged while discarding any showing cracks or significant corrosion. After selection, the chosen beams would be cut to size using acetylene torches, their ends beveled for welding, and then stored aside for further processing. Welding was an arduous task. Temperatures in Normandy during July 1944 soared into the high 80s and 90s Fahrenheit. Welders wore heavy leather protective gear, including face shields and gloves, as they handled beams weighing over 100 pounds each. The work took place either outdoors or under canvas shelters, because there wasn't enough time to establish proper workshops. Each device demanded several hours of welding effort. 4 prongs had to be meticulously welded to a crossbar, which in turn needed to be firmly attached to the tank's hull. Every weld had to withstand the immense forces exerted when a tank crashed into a hedgerow at full speed. Otherwise, a weak weld could break upon impact, potentially causing the tank to tip over just like unmodified tanks did. Ordnance units operated around the clock in shifts of 6 hours on and 12 off. To maintain continuous operations, acetylene cylinders and welding rods had to be constantly replenished via truck deliveries. If one ordnance unit ran low on supplies, trucks were dispatched to redistribute materials from those with excess inventory. The entire system functioned with the kind of adaptable flexibility that epitomized the best aspects of American military logistics. There were no elaborate plans or meticulously crafted production schedules. The sole focus was on producing as many devices as possible before Operation Cobra commenced. Tank crews from frontline units would transport their vehicles to nearby ordnance facilities, wait for the device to be fabricated and installed, then return to their units. Some crews waited 6 to 8 hours, while others stayed overnight. They endured these waits knowing that the device could potentially save their lives. Those who had witnessed friends fall victim to Panzerfaust fire when tanks approached hedgerows understood the importance of Culin's invention. They were willing to wait as long as needed for modifications to their tanks. The modified tanks started appearing in combat units by mid-July. Initially, there were only a few per battalion, with crews operating these upgraded vehicles volunteering for the most perilous missions to test them under real battle conditions. Reports coming back from these tests were overwhelmingly positive. The devices performed exactly as intended. Tanks could now breach hedgerows within seconds without exposing their vulnerable undersides. Tank commanders gained the ability to select their own routes through the Bocage, rather than being confined to roads or forced into gaps that might be under German fire. This tactical flexibility was revolutionary. By July 20, 5 days before Operation Cobra's scheduled start date, about 300 tanks in the First Army had been equipped with Culin's device. This accounted for roughly 15% of American armor in the theater. It wasn't sufficient. General Bradley demanded more. Medardus intensified production efforts accordingly. Additional ordnance units were redirected from their previous duties. Welders who were previously engaged in maintenance work were reassigned to fabricate hedgerow cutters. The tempo intensified, fueled by the urgent need to prepare for Operation Cobra and ensure that each tank was equipped with a device. By July 24, which was just 1 day before the launch of Operation Cobra, roughly 500 devices had been produced and attached to American tanks. This accounted for nearly 60% of the Sherman medium tanks, Stuart light tanks, and M10 tank destroyers that would take part in the offensive. While it wasn't a complete 100%, there hadn't been sufficient time to achieve that level of readiness. However, the number of devices was adequate, providing American armor with the mobility they required and restoring tactical flexibility. The tanks appeared intimidating with their newly installed equipment. The 4 steel prongs protruding from each hull gave the Sherman an aggressive, almost predatory appearance. Soldiers began referring to these modified tanks as rhino tanks due to the clear resemblance to horned animals in Africa. Others simply called them rhinoceros tanks. These nicknames quickly gained popularity and were widely recognized throughout the American Army within a short period. The British forces observed the American modifications and promptly developed their own version of the devices. The ordnance units in Britain named their equipment prongs and started manufacturing them using German beach obstacles, mirroring the American approach. By August, these prongs began to be fitted onto Sherman tanks in the British sector, although the scale of production was not as extensive as that achieved by the Americans. When German forces encountered Rhino tanks for the first time during Operation Cobra, they were caught off guard. There is no official designation for these devices in German documentation. However, after-action reports and interrogations refer to them variously as American Hedgerow tanks, tanks with steel horns, or simply modified Shermans. The German accounts clearly indicate that the appearance of these devices came as an unpleasant surprise. Prior to their deployment, German defensive tactics heavily relied on the assumption that American tanks could not navigate effectively through hedgerow terrain. This strategy was swiftly rendered ineffective when this assumption proved incorrect, leading to a rapid collapse in German defenses. In the days leading up to Operation Cobra, there was a frenzy of preparation. Infantry units practiced assault maneuvers, while artillery officers prepared their guns for targeted fire. Air Force liaison teams worked closely with ground forces to ensure air support would be readily available. Across the American sector, hundreds of Sherman tanks equipped with newly installed steel prongs underwent final testing. These tanks were trained in hedgerow breaching techniques, so that once the offensive commenced, they could swiftly exploit any breaches created by infantry and aerial attacks. On July 25, 1944, at 940 hours, the skies over Normandy buzzed with approaching aircraft. Over 1,500 B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators, forming massive formations that cast a dark shadow across the land, approached their targets near St. Louis. The bombers had departed from English bases early in the morning, climbing to high altitude over the English Channel before assembling into their formidable formations and flying southward toward the invasion beaches. The bombing objective was a rectangular area about 5 miles long and 1.5 miles wide between the towns of Monterey and Hebe-Cravon. This sector was occupied by German forces directly in the path of the impending American offensive. The purpose of this extensive carpet bombing was to obliterate enemy defenses, disrupt command structures, kill or disorient German soldiers, and generate chaos that would enable American ground troops to advance deep into German rear areas before organized resistance could be mounted. The bombardment commenced precisely at 940 hours, when the first wave of bombers dropped their payloads. A relentless rain of high-explosive bombs and fragmentation bombs fell from above, with bombs ranging in weight from 500 pounds to 2,000 pounds, detonating almost instantly upon impact. The explosions caused the ground to tremble violently, creating a scene that was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. The trees were shattered into fragments, and hedgerows were completely destroyed. Buildings crumbled under the force of the explosions. German soldiers caught outside or in substandard shelters were instantly killed by blasts or shredded by flying debris. Those who managed to survive the initial onslaught were left stunned, deafened, and unable to think clearly or function properly. The bombing lasted for nearly an hour as wave after wave of heavy bombers flew over the target area, releasing their payloads before heading back to England. This was followed by about 1,000 medium bombers and fighter bombers that dropped incendiary bombs and additional explosives. By the time all aircraft had departed, around 33 tons of high-explosive bombs and 60,000 incendiary bombs had been released over the target zone. The bombardment covered an area of approximately 12 square kilometers, with roughly 5,000 bombs per square kilometer. The landscape was turned into a moonscape filled with overlapping craters, splintered trees, and burning debris. However, the precision that the bombardiers had aimed for proved elusive. The target area was close to American front lines, in some spots separated by just a few hundred yards. Thick clouds severely limited visibility, forcing bomb aimers to rely on dead reckoning and radar, both of which are highly inaccurate methods even under ideal conditions. As a result, some bombs fell short of the intended target zone, landing instead on American positions. The consequences were devastating. 111 American soldiers were killed and nearly 500 wounded by their own aircraft's ordnance. Among those who lost their lives was Lieutenant General Leslie James McNair, who had been observing the bombardment from a forward position with troops of the 30th Infantry Division. He became the highest-ranking American officer to be killed in combat in Europe during World War II. At the time of his passing, he was a lieutenant general, but he received a posthumous promotion to full general. His death significantly dampened American spirits and served as a somber reminder of the dangers inherent in close air support missions. Casualties from friendly fire intensified following an incident on July 25th, which followed another deadly occurrence the day before when aborted bombing runs due to inclement weather resulted in several aircraft mistakenly releasing their payloads, causing over 150 American casualties. The total number of accidental casualties resulting from Operation Cobra's bombardment surpassed 800 fatalities and injuries. Despite these devastating losses, the operation accomplished its main goal, dismantling German defenses within the targeted area. One of the elite armored divisions protecting this region, the Panzerlehr Division, suffered severe damage to its ranks. Its commanding officer, General Fritz Bayerlein, later recounted the devastation with vivid imagery that conveyed the sheer force and magnitude of the attack. He described a scene filled with billowing dust clouds and earth shooting up into the air from bomb impacts. The front lines appeared as desolate lunar terrain, with at least 70% of his forces incapacitated or dead. Approximately 1,000 German soldiers were killed during this bombardment. Dozens of command centers were demolished, severing the communication network that enabled coordination among German defense units. Explosions severed telephone cables and toppled radio antennae, leaving officers unable to relay orders to their subordinates. Those who survived the barrage emerged from shelters in a state of shock or suffering from traumatic injuries like concussion and deafness. Defenses that had held firm against weeks of American assaults were shattered within just 1 hour. Amidst this chaos, advancing American ground forces pressed forward. The 7th Corps under Major General J led the charge into the ravaged battlefield. Lawton Collins spearheaded Operation Cobra. Known for his aggressive tactics and exceptional competence as a corps commander in the American Army, Collins was renowned for his ability to sustain momentum and capitalize on successes. His moniker, Lightning Joe, derived from his swift actions during Pacific battles, encapsulated his preference for rapid and forceful maneuvers. The assault unit of 7th Corps comprised 3 infantry divisions. The 4th Division positioned on the right flank, the 9th in the center, and the 13th to the left. These units had been engaged since D-Day and were seasoned, resilient fighters eager to advance. Their objective was to breach weakened German defenses south of St. Louis, creating a pathway for American armor. Supporting these infantry divisions were 2 armored divisions. Major General Edward Brooks led the 2nd Armored Division, while Major General Leroy Watson commanded the 3rd Armored Division, both key components of Operation Cobra's armored contingent. Approximately 60% of their Sherman tanks were outfitted with Curtis Culin's Hedgerows cutter devices. The infantry assault commenced in the early afternoon on July 25, shortly after the aerial bombardment ceased. Advancing through the ravaged terrain, American forces initially proceeded cautiously, anticipating German resistance at any juncture. However, the Germans' defense was fragmented and ineffective. Surviving soldiers were disoriented and unable to mount coherent resistance. Some remained immobilized in bomb craters, while others struggled with buried weapons or expended ammunition. Communication between German units had collapsed entirely, leaving officers incapable of coordinating defenses with superiors or adjacent forces. On July 25, the initial advance extended roughly 1 mile past the starting point, which was less than anticipated, indicating that despite heavy bombardment, German resistance had not been entirely eradicated. Even damaged Hedgerows continued to offer some defensive advantages. The American infantry faced the arduous task of clearing each field of enemy positions through intense close combat. However, the opposition lacked the organized and coordinated defense seen in earlier battles. Instead, it consisted of isolated acts of bravery or desperation from scattered German survivors. Major General Culin, observing the situation from his forward command post, noticed something that others might have overlooked. The resistance, although still potent, was disorganized. German defenses were fragmented, with no cohesive strategy being implemented, no systematic counterattacks, and no efforts to set up new defensive lines. The extensive bombardment had effectively disrupted the German command structure, leaving units operating independently without support or direction. Rather than bending under American pressure, the German front line was collapsing. Late in the afternoon of July 25, Culin made a decisive move that transformed Operation Cobra from a limited offensive into a breakthrough, with far-reaching consequences for the Normandy campaign. He instructed his 2 armored divisions to commence their advance ahead of schedule. The original plan had called for infantry to create a broad corridor before armor moved in. However, Culin recognized that delaying the armored assault could give the Germans time to regroup and fortify new positions. He opted to commit his tanks immediately, while the enemy was still disoriented from the bombardment, betting on the ability of American forces to capitalize on the chaos before German defenses solidified. The armored exploitation began at dawn on July 26 with Combat Command A of the 2nd Armored Division, under Brigadier General Morris Rose, advancing southward from St. Rose received orders to advance as quickly and aggressively as possible. He was a bold leader with expertise in armored warfare, capable of capitalizing on opportunities effectively. His unit included Sherman tanks, tank destroyers, mechanized infantry, half-tracks, and self-propelled artillery. Importantly, most of his tanks were fitted with Cullin's hedgerow cutting devices. For the first time since D-Day, American armor enjoyed unprecedented mobility and freedom to maneuver in the Normandy Bocage region. The Rhino tanks breached one hedgerow after another, selecting their own paths, evading German strongholds, and exploiting weaknesses in the crumbling German defenses. Tank crews no longer had to confine themselves to roads, where German anti-tank guns might be hidden or search for gaps in the hedgerows that could be covered by enemy fire. Instead, they moved cross-country at will, tearing through obstacles as needed, maintaining their momentum and preventing Germans from setting up new defensive positions. The psychological effect on the German forces was devastating. For 6 weeks, German troops had depended on the Bocage terrain as a crucial defensive asset. They used the hedgerows to funnel American attacks into pre-planned killing zones and positioned anti-tank weapons to cover the limited routes through which American armor could advance. Suddenly, unexpectedly, American tanks began appearing from directions previously considered impassable due to the hedgerows. The entire German defense system, meticulously constructed over weeks of fighting, became obsolete within a single day. German counterattacks were ineffective. Small groups of German infantry who tried to impede American progress found themselves bypassed and cut off as American tanks broke through hedgerows on both flanks. German anti-tank guns, carefully placed to cover roads and known passages, discovered their fields of fire obstructed by the hedgerows, while American tanks emerged from unexpected directions. German commanders struggled to coordinate defenses due to an inability to predict where American armor would appear next. By midday on July 26, Leading elements of the 2nd Armored Division had advanced 6 miles beyond their initial position. In half a day, they advanced 6 miles, a distance greater than the First Army managed over the course of 2 weeks in intense, attritional fighting. The difference was stark and striking. Marigny, an important road junction located 6 kilometers south of the initial position, fell to the combined efforts of the 1st Infantry Division and the 3rd Armored Division. German prisoners, many recently arrived from training battalions in Germany, surrendered in large numbers, overwhelming American units which directed them to walk to the rear without guards due to a shortage of military police. A senior non-commissioned officer in a German medical unit named Klein recorded his thoughts in a diary entry for July 26. "Today we realized everything is lost. The Americans have broken through. Their tanks are everywhere, advancing from directions we considered impossible. Our defensive positions, which held for weeks, are now useless. Soldiers are talking openly about survival rather than victory and escape instead of defense. Morale has crumbled overnight." On July 27, the American advance intensified. The 30th Infantry Division, which had suffered heavy casualties from friendly fire on July 25, reported, "This thing is wide open." Meanwhile, the 3rd Armored Division reached Coutances, a crucial road junction around 15 miles behind what was previously the German front line just 2 days earlier. As German forces attempted to withdraw south to avoid encirclement, they found their routes blocked by American armor that had already penetrated deep into their rear areas. German units were isolated, encircled, wiped out, or compelled to surrender en masse. The progress made by July 28 surpassed even the most optimistic forecasts set forth by General Bradley. In just 3 days, American troops had advanced over 30 miles beyond their initial positions. The German 7th Army, which had managed to hold its ground against American forces for 6 weeks in the Bocage region, was now retreating in disarray, with units dispersed and command structures fragmented, leaving it incapable of mounting a cohesive defense. What once appeared as an insurmountable obstacle due to the challenging terrain of the Bocage had been overcome by American forces, which were now positioned beyond this area. Ahead lay more open territory in central France, where American mobility and firepower could be utilized to their fullest potential without hindrance. Post-combat analysis conducted by American intelligence officers several weeks after Operation Cobra revealed that Rhino tanks played a crucial role. They reviewed after-action reports, interviewed unit leaders, and gathered data on how hedgerows were breached during the offensive. The findings were unequivocal. Roughly 70% of successful breaches were achieved using Culin's devices installed on these tanks. The remaining 30% required support from engineers with explosives, bulldozers, or manual labor, methods that were much slower and more vulnerable to enemy fire. Tank crews reported that the Culin devices enabled them to penetrate typical Norman hedgerows in less than 10 seconds, from initial impact to emergence on the far side. This rapid pace was essential for sustaining momentum and preventing German forces from repositioning to counter each breach. Previously, breaching hedgerows had taken anywhere between 10 minutes and half an hour, giving Germans ample time to prepare defensive fire against such operations. The speed advantage offered by Rhino tanks provided American forces with the tactical surprise and tempo necessary for swift exploitation of their gains. Additionally, analysis showed that American tanks equipped with Culin devices suffered about 40% fewer losses compared to unmodified tanks in Bocage terrain. The primary reason was straightforward. These modified tanks did not expose their vulnerable undersides when crossing hedgerows, eliminating the most common cause of tank casualties during this period. German Panzerfaust teams, which had inflicted significant damage on American armor earlier that summer, found their tactics rendered ineffective against Rhino tanks that could drive through hedgerows at ground level. Operation Cobra's strategic impact was swift, profound, and extensive. By July 31, merely 6 days into the operation, the WWII Corps had seized the town of Avranches, a location military historians refer to as the gateway to Brittany and southern Normandy. The capture of Avranches facilitated pathways southward into Brittany and eastward towards central France. What had been a stagnant Normandy front for 6 weeks suddenly disintegrated. German troops who had previously excelled in defensive positions struggled to execute mobile defense on open terrain against American armor that now maneuvered freely. Allied forces surged through the breach at Avranches with great speed, akin to water flowing through a ruptured dam. On August 1, 1944, Lieutenant General George Smith Patton, Jr., assumed command of the newly formed 3rd United States Army. Known for his aggressive and controversial leadership style, Patton was an expert in armored warfare who favored rapid exploitation and deep penetration tactics. The mission of the Third Army was to capitalize on the breakthrough achieved by First Army, advancing southward into Brittany to seize ports and eastwards towards the Seine River to encircle German forces still active in Normandy. Under Patton's leadership, the Third Army advanced at an astonishing pace that amazed both American and German commanders alike. Armored columns sped across France, sometimes covering up to 50 miles in a single day, bypassing strong German positions and leaving isolated units behind for infantry mop-up operations. The grinding attrition warfare scene from D-Day to late July transformed almost overnight into a war of maneuver where Allied advantages in mobility, logistics, and air power could be fully utilized. Paris was liberated on August 25, just 1 month after Operation Cobra commenced, with General Charles de Gaulle leading French forces as German resistance collapsed. By mid-August, the encirclement and destruction of German forces in the Falaise pocket had trapped between 50,000 to 100,000 German soldiers and rendered entire divisions combat ineffective. Tanks, artillery, and vehicles that escaped the pocket were subsequently destroyed by Allied fighter-bombers as they retreated. The Wehrmacht in France never fully recovered from this devastating defeat. For Curtis Culin, recognition came through military awards and media attention, though these accolades brought a mix of joy and melancholy. General Omar Bradley personally recommended Culin for the Legion of Merit. A decoration usually reserved for officers who demonstrated exceptionally meritorious conduct and outstanding service was bestowed upon Culin. The award citation highlighted how his invention played a crucial role in Operation Cobra, significantly contributing to the success of American armored forces by restoring their tactical mobility at a critical juncture in the campaign. This achievement garnered widespread media attention across the United States, catapulting Culin into celebrity status. His hometown newspaper, the Cranford Citizen and Chronicle, published an extensive article on September 7, 1944, detailing how a local sergeant had invented a device that revolutionized warfare in Normandy and helped secure the Allied breakthrough. Interviews with his parents, who still resided in Cranford, provided insights into Cullin's pre-war life as an ordinary young man working in the liquor industry. The story resonated with the American narrative of citizen soldiers utilizing practical ingenuity to overcome challenges that eluded trained experts. However, Culin remained humble throughout his career and consistently downplayed his role in the invention. In conversations with his superiors and subsequent interviews with journalists, he emphasized the Tennessee soldier whose casual remark had inspired the initial idea. Despite this modesty, Cullin's fame overshadowed any attempts to share credit. Historian Max Hastings mentioned a Tennessee soldier as the source of inspiration, but did not provide further details about him or verify his identity through primary sources. Since then, military historians have failed to uncover documentation confirming the existence and background of this individual. The absence of corroborating evidence leaves the account based solely on oral history or anecdotal information. 4 months after Culin's demonstration of his invention on July 14th, his involvement in World War II came to an abrupt end when he was severely injured during combat operations near the Hedgerows Forest in November 1944. The Battle of Hedgerows Forest, fought by American forces along the German-Belgian border southeast of Aachen, was one of the longest and most brutal engagements in Europe. It involved a grueling attritional struggle through dense, forested terrain reminiscent of Normandy's Bocage, compounded by harsh winter conditions and fierce resistance from determined German defenders on their home soil. On November 2nd, while navigating through the Hedgerows Forest, Sergeant Curtis Culin stepped on a German anti-personnel mine that shattered his left leg. He stumbled, and as he fell, triggered a second mine that inflicted severe injuries to his right thigh. His comrades swiftly evacuated him under fire, taking him first to a field hospital before moving him through the medical evacuation chain to facilities in Belgium and ultimately England. Despite saving his life, surgeons were unable to salvage his damaged leg, which had been shattered beyond repair, necessitating an amputation. Thus, his time as a combat soldier came to an end. Curtis Culin returned home to the United States in 1945 for ongoing recovery and rehabilitation. In that same year, he married Bernice and Wright in Cranford. However, their union would later dissolve in divorce during the early 1950s. He relocated to New York City, like many other veterans transitioning back into civilian life after years of warfare, striving to establish a regular existence post-conflict. Employed as a salesman for Schenley Industries, he followed in his father's footsteps at the liquor distributor, where both had previously worked before Curtis' military service. Raising a family and living a quiet life, he rarely spoke about his wartime experiences or his role in contributing to the Allied victory in France. On January 10, 1961, President Dwight David Eisenhower addressed an audience of engineers and business leaders at the Statler Hilton Hotel in Washington, D.C., shortly before leaving office. Accepting the Hoover Medal Award from the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, he highlighted Curtis Culin's story as a testament to American ingenuity and the necessity of fostering organizational systems that allow ideas to rise regardless of rank or formal qualifications. Eisenhower, who had commanded Allied forces in Europe and orchestrated the Normandy invasion at the highest strategic level, recounted how Sergeant Culin proposed attaching large steel knives to tanks to cut through embankments, enabling them to proceed more safely. This innovative concept was relayed up the chain of command until it reached General Bradley, who promptly implemented it. Eisenhower concluded by stressing that the greatest satisfaction among Allied forces on that night came from those aware of how effectively this solution had saved countless lives. He then pointed out that Culin had subsequently lost his leg, but was still healthy and working as a salesman in New York when Eisenhower last saw him. This speech served to underscore Eisenhower's belief that good ideas can originate from any part of an organization, emphasizing the need for leaders to establish systems that foster innovation from the grassroots level. It also highlighted that some of the most significant contributions often come not from high-ranking officers or experts, but from ordinary individuals who identify and resolve issues effectively. Curtis Grub Culin III passed away on November 20, 1963, in Greenwich Village, Manhattan, New York, at the age of 48. The causes of his death are unspecified in historical records. He was laid to rest with military honors in Fairview Cemetery in Westfield, New Jersey, near Cranford, his hometown. As a veteran of the 102nd Cavalry Group and recipient of awards such as the Legion of Merit and Purple Heart, he was interred as someone who played a crucial role in breaking the Normandy stalemate and significantly aiding the Allied victory in France. A memorial plaque was later installed on a boulder outside the Cranford Municipal Building to honor his service and contributions. The Culin hedgerow cutter continued to be used by American armored forces for the remainder of the European conflict, although its significance and usefulness decreased as Allied forces moved from the Normandy hedgerows into more open terrain in central and eastern France. Although many Rhino-equipped tanks participated in the liberation of Paris, the race across France, and even winter campaigns in Germany, the unique nature of Normandy's hedgerows meant that these devices were less beneficial in other theaters. British forces in Normandy noticed the American Rhino tanks and quickly developed their own version using German beach obstacles as source material. By mid-July, British ordnance units began manufacturing prongs for Sherman 5 tanks used by British and Canadian units. By August 1944, factories had produced 600 Mark I prongs, followed by 1,000 Mark II and 500 Mark III prongs for various tank types including Sherman's, M10 tank destroyers, and Cromwell tanks. Even some Churchill tanks were outfitted with prongs despite their design differences. The story of Curtis Culin and the hedgerow cutter remains a cornerstone in American military tradition, regularly featured in service academies, staff colleges, and professional military education courses as an example of battlefield innovation and organizational flexibility. This narrative underscores several enduring lessons, such as the critical importance of fostering a culture that encourages creativity at all levels within the command structure. Curtis Culin was a sergeant and an enlisted man rather than an officer or a trained engineer, but his superiors were receptive to his idea, provided resources for testing, and forwarded successful demonstrations to higher command levels. This openness to ideas from any source exemplified the American military at its finest. Additionally, this narrative underscores the significance of practical ingenuity and hands-on problem-solving over formal training and theoretical knowledge when addressing unforeseen challenges. The hedgerow issue was a tactical challenge that Allied intelligence and planning staffs had not anticipated. There were no established doctrines or specialized equipment for dealing with such terrain. Training exercises in England prior to D-Day focused predominantly on beach assault techniques, neglecting inland operations entirely. The solution emerged from the ground level, where a soldier identified the problem, considered available materials, and devised a practical fix rather than coming from high-level planning or research laboratories. Furthermore, this story highlights the crucial importance of swift implementation once a promising solution is identified. General Bradley's decision to authorize immediate mass production of the Culin device, mobilizing every ordnance unit in the American sector for round-the-clock manufacturing, transformed a single sergeant's improvisation into a widespread capability within less than 2 weeks. This rapid execution was feasible due to the flexibility of American military logistics and industrial capacity, which allowed for quick adaptation. In a more rigid system, such a device might have undergone extensive evaluation by engineering boards, been sent to factories in the United States for mass production, and finally issued to units months later, missing the critical window entirely. The hedgerow problem has since become a subject of extensive study in military education, as an example of how even superior intelligence can fail to predict crucial tactical challenges. Allied intelligence officers had detailed aerial photographs of Normandy taken weeks and months before D-Day, clearly showing the landscape with its countless enclosed fields and hedgerows. Photo interpreters could count the hedgerows and measure their dimensions accurately, but no one in the intelligence chain or planning staffs considered how tanks would navigate through this terrain, or what impact these ancient field boundaries might have on tactical operations. This lack of foresight nearly led to a prolonged stalemate during the Normandy invasion. A battalion commander reflected on this oversight in a post-war interview, expressing frustration similar to that felt by many combat officers. "We were trained endlessly for beach assaults, but not prepared for what lay ahead inland. We repeatedly practiced amphibious landings, familiarizing ourselves with the expected conditions on the beaches and honing our skills for those specific challenges. However, not a single day was dedicated to inland operations training. No exercise simulated combat in Bocage terrain. Consequently, we entered Normandy unprepared for the actual fighting ahead, resulting in thousands of casualties due to this lack of preparation. American soldiers who fought through the Bocage from June to July 1944 faced some of the most arduous and disheartening combat conditions experienced during World War II. The terrain significantly diminished their advantages in firepower, mobility, and air support. Casualties were often comparable or worse than those seen in the worst battles of World War I. Friendships and camaraderie were tested as futile attacks against seemingly impregnable positions led to the deaths of comrades. For weeks, they engaged in a traditional form of combat without any clear end in sight. There was no breakthrough, no victory, only endless fields, hedgerows, and relentless German machine guns. Despite these challenges, soldiers persevered through sheer courage, discipline, adaptation, and innovation. They developed new tactics and adapted to conditions their training had not anticipated. When a fellow soldier devised a solution to the central tactical problem they faced, it was quickly adopted and used to break the stalemate that had held them back for 6 weeks. The breakout from Normandy in late July and August 1944 fundamentally changed the course of the war in Western Europe. From late July through December 1944, Allied forces advanced from the Norman coast all the way to the German border, liberating France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and parts of the Netherlands. The Wehrmacht, which had successfully held its ground against the Allies in Bocage, suffered catastrophic defeats at Falaise and during subsequent retreats across France. Its combat power was effectively shattered. Divisions were decimated, years of equipment production wasted, leaving the path to Germany open. The collapse of Nazi Germany in May 1945 was due to overwhelming pressure from various fronts. Soviet troops advancing from the east had pushed the Germans back from Stalingrad and Moscow all the way to Berlin. Allied strategic bombers devastated German industry, crippling the Nazi war economy, while Anglo-American forces advanced into Germany from the west after crossing the Rhine and penetrating deep into enemy territory. However, the Western Allied advance, which played a crucial role in Germany's defeat, started with the breakout from Normandy. This breakthrough began when a sergeant from New Jersey devised a way to clear hedgerows using scrap metal and ingenuity. Curtis Culin's story exemplifies what can happen when ordinary individuals face extraordinary challenges and refuse to believe problems are insurmountable. It highlights an organizational culture that values outcomes over credentials and is open to ideas from anyone, regardless of rank. It underscores the American tradition of practical problem-solving, the belief that any issue can be resolved with clear thinking and creative use of available resources underpins this approach. This narrative also demonstrates how individual initiative can significantly impact history when leaders recognize and act on good ideas swiftly. The steel prongs Culin welded to a Sherman tank in July 1944 not only cleared hedgerows, but also broke the deadlock that had threatened to turn the largest amphibious invasion into a disastrous failure. This innovation undermined German confidence in their defensive tactics and the perceived invincibility of the Bocage terrain. It opened pathways from Normandy to Paris, from Paris to the Rhine, and ultimately to Berlin. The solution Culin created shattered the last hope of preventing Allied victory in the West. On that fateful July day, when Omar Bradley observed a Sherman tank breach a hedgerow that had halted American progress for 6 weeks, he saw a turning point as pivotal as any major battle. As Bradley later noted, the answer was absurdly simple but effective enough to stump an entire army for over 5 weeks. However, simplicity does not detract from its significance. Often, the best solutions are straightforward and practical rather than complex or sophisticated. A sergeant armed with a welding torch and an open-minded approach often achieves what even highly trained generals and engineers with vast resources cannot. In the summer and autumn of 1944, Rhino tanks rolled through France, cutting through seemingly insurmountable obstacles and restoring mobility to American armored units. This allowed Allied forces to swiftly advance from Normandy to Germany. These devices were crude creations fashioned from scrap metal by desperate individuals fighting a war that demanded immediate solutions. They did not enhance the tank's firepower or require advanced technology, exotic materials, or complex manufacturing processes. Instead, they consisted of simple steel prongs welded onto the front of the vehicles. Yet they proved effective in overcoming barriers and advancing the cause. Curtis Culin never sought recognition for his invention. He consistently tried to acknowledge the person whose casual comment had inspired him, though that individual remains unknown today. After the war, he returned to civilian life as a salesman, raising a family while rarely discussing his military service or his contribution to one of World War II's critical innovations. History remembers Curtis Culin for his ingenuity and persistence. Military historians recognize him, and the tankers who used his device remember him fondly, knowing it helped them survive battles they might otherwise have lost. His story is passed down to new generations as a testament to the power of individual initiative and practical problem-solving. In war, the most effective weapons are not necessarily the most powerful or technologically advanced ones. Sometimes they are simply those that address immediate challenges, devised by ordinary people with exceptional insight, and implemented swiftly under the pressure of survival. The tale of Curtis Culin's invention underscores the importance of innovation, organizational adaptability, and the impact of recognizing and acting on good ideas promptly. Curtis Culin's straightforward welding technique ended the Normandy impasse, altered the trajectory of World War II, and contributed significantly to liberating an entire continent from oppression. This achievement merits perpetual recognition,